because during Duterte's time, Philippines and China had a very friendly relationship. But once Duterte is out of the office, U.S. scooped in to make the offer that Bongbong Marcos couldn't refuse, and that relationship flipped.
Well, there are a lot of people in Philippines now, and I was talking to some directly from here that they are missing the days of when Duterte was in power, especially in light of what Bongbong just did. Of course, the announcements, I didn't trust what he said when he was here in Washington. And I followed that trip closely, that visit, and I read the statements issued during the state dinner at that time. To me, when he said that, well, the Filipino government is going to limit U.S. bases in the Philippines, I don't think so. He meant to say it. I think he was given the marching orders to state something like this publicly, but there was no intention of following through. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Carl.
Well, I mean, we can look at the facts. U.S. started with the basing agreement in the Philippines. Well, first of all, U.S. used to have one of the largest U.S. overseas military base, the Clark Air Base, and also the largest overseas naval base, the Subic Naval Base in the Philippines. And U.S. got kicked out after the end of Cold War. After Philippines, they had the People's Revolution that throw out Bongbong Marcos' father, the Marcos the Senior.
Marcos.
And one of the reason is, one of the reason U.S. military base is not popular is because they bring crime, they bring prostitution, they harass locals, and they, the local is bearing a burden. So the Philippine Parliament back then said, okay, if you want to stay, you have to pay more. We're gonna have to charge you more because this is a burden on us. And at that time, U.S. didn't want to pay more, so they're out of there. So now U.S. is trying to come back in. And first of all, they did the basing agreement to have 4 Filipino military bases open to the U.S. military. And then last year, they amended that to add 5 more bases. So there's now 9 bases in the Philippines open to the U.S. military. So what Bongbong Marcos said is obviously not correct. The trend is going up. They're opening up more and more military bases to the U.S. And this is a quite departure from Duterte's policy. Duterte's policy was specifically pivoting away from the United States because Duterte realized the Philippines has been far too dependent on U.S. and he wanted to pursue an independent Philippine foreign policy, and that's why he reached out to Russia and he reached out to China. And as a matter of fact, we didn't have this blow up in the South China Sea dispute during Duterte's presidency because we now know that Duterte just gave an exclusive interview to Global Times, and he's pointed out that back in 2014, Philippines and China had a gentleman's agreement when it comes to their dispute. So the history of the particular dispute around the second Thomas Shoal, which is it's not an island, it's a reef. It's a reef which is submerged underwater in high tide. So this dispute actually dates to 1990s. Like the claim of South China Sea that goes back a little bit more, in the 19th and in the 18th and 19th century, when the European colonial powers started to sail their ships through South China Sea, when they were passing through the 2 main island groups, the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, they only saw Chinese fishermen from the Highland Islands. And there's some explanation for why that is. It could be during that time in the 18th century, there's plenty of fish in the coastal waters. So people from the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, they didn't need to, sail very far to fishing. Whereas China experienced a population explosion in the 19th century, and because the population pressure probably drove these Chinese fishermen from Highland Islands to to sail further. And also, before the age of motorboats, the fishermen really don't go very far from their shore to fish. So the sailing is done by current and wind,
Yeah.
and in particular in South China Sea, it's done by monsoon wind. The Europeans, they have a little bit advantage in terms of sailing, because the European ships are designed to sail in the Atlantic, where it's much stormier. So the European
Yeah.
ships are more sturdier, and they have the multi-rig sails that can manipulate. So the European ships back then could sail into the wind. But the Asian ships at that time, they're usually a single mast or triple mast, but they are just like a big square sail, the traditional Chinese junks. So
Yeah.
they use the weather pattern, the monsoon wind. So what the fishermen in the Highland Islands, they would do is, when the wind blows from north to south, they will sail to the islands in the South China Sea. They will fish for 6 months. And when the monsoon wind changes, they sail back home. So and on those islands, they build their shelters for their stay for that 6 months. Because most of the islands are uninhabited, because for other 6 months of time, because there's only 2 islands that have fresh water source, right? So the rest of the rocks, they're just rocks and reefs. And what happened is, the dispute came about in the 1930s, when Japan defeated China in 1894, 95, and China had to give up Taiwan to Japan. Taiwan became a Japanese colony, and using Taiwan as a base, Japan started to infiltrate South China Sea, and the Japanese started to harvesting guano. Guano is a bird poop, which was used as fertilizer. And so Japanese started to harvest guano from South China Sea islands. And that's when the French colonial authority in Vietnam, and they're like, oh, whoa, we better grab, China is in no position to stop the Japanese. We better grab those islands before the Japanese come in. So in 1930s, while China was, in its still warlord period, different warlords fighting each other, KMT fighting the communists, they didn't have time to, enforce their claim on South China Sea. So French came in, occupied Spratly Islands and Paracel Islands to preempt the Japanese takeover. But even so, the French garrison in Spratly Islands and Paracel Islands, they had to be supplied by the Chinese fishermen coming regularly from Highland Islands, because those are the only fishermen that regularly travel through those waters. So even the French garrison that posted on those islands have to be supplied by Chinese fishermen. But Japan, after World War II, they took over all the islands in South China Sea. But as the defeat of when the defeat of Japan happened, Japan gave up all the claims of all the territory it occupies, including Taiwan, including the islands in South China Sea. So in 1946, Chiang Kai-shek's government, a nationalist government, they sent warships to make claims on these South China Sea islands. That's when they draw the 11 dash line all around South China Sea, and they put boundary markers on these islands. And at that time, United States had no problem, because Chiang Kai-shek is a U.S. ally, and so they did not contest the Chinese claim. At that time, U.S. still controlled the Philippines as a colony, by the way. And so, but what happened is, when the Chinese Civil War comes around in 1950, the People's Liberation Army landed on the Highland Islands, the largest island in South China Sea. And the KMT forces withdrew from Highland Island to Taiwan. So suddenly all the KMT garrisons in the South China Sea islands in Spratlys and Paracel become isolated. And it was like, okay, we already lost Highland Islands. What's the point of having this isolated garrison out there? So the KMT pulled out in 1950 as a result of losing the Highland Islands to Communist China. Then in 1951, there was a Filipino businessman. He's claimed he certainly discovered the Spratly Islands. so after that, mainland China and the KMT government on Taiwan's like, oh crap, we kind of, we left a vacuum. So they went back to occupy the largest island.
The largest island.
So from mainland China, they sail from Highland Island. They occupy the Woody Island in the Paracel Island chain. Woody Island is the largest island that has fresh water source in the Paracel Islands. And the KMT military, they sailed to Taiping Island, aka Ituaba, which is also the largest island in the Spratly Island chain that also has fresh water source. So they reasserted the claim, but the Filipino claim didn't. The Filipino businessmen's claim didn't go away. So in 1970s, the Filipino government officially they claimed they bought the claim from that Filipino businessman who originally claimed to discover the Spratly Islands. And so the official Philippine claim to that area dates from 1970. And this is important because Tony Blinken just went to the Philippines. He stressed the U.S. ironclad commitment to the U.S.-Filipino Mutual Defense Treaty. And he claimed that it extends to the South China Sea as well. But the fact is, the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty was signed at the time when Philippines just became independent. And the treaty was signed in 1951. And in 1951, the Filipino government did not make the claim. They haven't made the claim to the South China Sea yet. And the boundary of the Philippines was defined. So the history for people who don't know, Philippines was a Spanish colony, and the U.S. acquired it after the Spanish-American War. So the boundary of the Philippines, when U.S. occupied it from Spain, it was defined in the 1898 Treaty of Paris. There was a clearly delineated boundary that did not include the islands in the South China Sea. So that is a boundary that was defined by that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty was bounded by. They were supposed to defend the sovereign Filipino territory that was defined by 1898 Paris Treaty. But what happened is in the 1970s, after the Filipino government made this new claim, and now Tony Blinken basically he expanded the scope of the original U.S.-Filipino treaty, mutual defense to cover. He claimed that U.S. treaty would cover the South China Sea as well. And now in the 20th century, UN. All the countries in the UN, they came up with UNCLOS, UN Law of the Sea.
Okay, he'll come back. So, Alejandro, I do see your statements here. And yes, I did hear about demonstrations that's going on right now in Philippines. We don't hear much about them here. One of my contacts inside Philippines, that's how I knew about it. Nothing is reported here. Because the Filipino people are getting really anxious now about what Marco Bongbong is doing, dragging Philippines into some major issues there. So, I lost Carl. He'll be back here, so he's going to reconnect later on. I give him about 3 minutes. And as you heard, Carl, the historical aspect does not get included in the conversation of the likes of Secretary of State when he got is the same arguments that's been made about Okinawa. This is why we never, for us here in the West, not all of us, of course, those who know the history of Okinawa, they understand the reality of it. Average Westerner, does not understand this kind of a reality that Okinawa was never part of Japan to begin with. It's the same arguments to some outside the United States might never understand that Hawaii is the same argument like Okinawa. Hawaii was never part of the U.S. And this is why the historical aspect is very important. I'm glad Carl addressed this historical aspect for people to understand where things are, because you all know these guys by now. history can be manipulated. So if you don't know the facts or you did the research about it, a lot of people end up being misled. Oh, just because it was written by government, or just because this university or that university wrote the book about historical. No, 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 no. Even universities themselves, they can really manipulate based on what the government wants them. I mean, I look at like here in the US, and again, it's not about criticizing my country or the institutions here, but will I trust what Harvard puts out? Will I trust what Stanford, Yale, Vanderbilt, you name it? No, I won't, because I know what's going on, what goes on behind closed doors between those institutions, academia, and the United States government in Washington. Same argument. So this is why it's important to understand the history of it. Western institutions, and again, I'm not about criticizing my country. My country does wrong, and if it does wrong, I gotta call it out. Institutions, academia tends to manipulate history or historical fact. And like I mentioned to you earlier, Okinawa is an example. So Hawaii is an example. Even the state of Texas, it never belonged to the US, it belonged to the Mexico. So it's the same thing. I'm glad Carl mentioned this one about Philippines, especially the two islands, for you guys to understand. So now, yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so I got interrupted because my modem, I have to start it at least once a day for some reason. This is why I need continued
Why you live in a jungle? You live in jungle. You know what you need to do, Carl? I have a suggestion for you. You need to have a satellite connection through Beidou. And this way you don't have to run to any issue.
I tried satellite dish before, but it's slow. It's slow, and
really?
It's also affected by weather. If it rains, a storm, the signal is not very good. So this is why I need continued Chinese investment into Indonesian infrastructure. I need 5G over here. So back to the Philippines. Starting from 1970 onwards, there's a kind of rush. Gold rush to occupy different features, different reefs. China in 1980s, they finally made before they were concentrated on the Paracel Islands. So in 1980s, China occupied about nine reefs in the Spratly Islands. One of them is a Mischief Reef. So at that time, the Philippines felt okay, they're falling behind in their enforcing their claim. So in 1999, they sent out a World War II era naval ship. It was originally a U.S. warship that was given to South Vietnam, and after South Vietnam fell, that it was transferred to the Philippines. So it was a really old, rickety ship. So they ran that ship into the Second Thomas Shaw just to stick their claim. And at that time, China was not very happy about this. Like, why are you running the ship here? And the Filipino president in 1999, Estrada, he actually apologized. He said, "Oh, it's an accident. It's a mechanical failure. Don't worry about it. We will get the ship out there," which is completely bogus. But he said, "Oh, but he did make a promise to China. He said it's a mechanical failure. We'll tow the ship away." Of course, now we're like 25 years later. That ship is still sitting over there. So this is the origin of that particular dispute around Second Thomas Shaw. So what happened is the Philippine government, they stick a dozen Marines on the ship, on this stranded ship. But those Marines need to be supplied, right? Because it's so what happened is China would send Coast Guard to surround the reef, and they will try to block the Filipino supply ship. But in 2014, when Duterte was in power, Duterte worked out a gentleman's agreement with China. China says, okay, we want to have friendly ties with the Philippines. We don't want this like cat and mouse chase between our Coast Guard and your supply ship to make have an impact on our bilateral ties. So let's do this. So China agreed to allow Philippines to send regular supplies to their Marines trapped on that stranded ship, Sierra Madre. in return, the Philippines promised they're not going to send any building materials. And so China's like, okay, humanitarian reasons, we know those people need to eat. You can go ahead and send them food, but we don't want you to send building materials. We don't want you to build up the island, because we still claim that island. And so that agreement held throughout Duterte's presidency. Now, under what happened, why there's a flare up recently? Because after 25 years, that rusting World War II era ship is falling apart. It's falling apart. So now, in contravention of the gentleman's agreement they work out with China, now the Philippines are sending building supplies, trying to build up reinforce their position on the second Thomas Shoal. This is why that led to the confrontation between the two sides, when the situation escalated, first the former aides to Duterte revealed this gentleman's agreement in the Filipino press, and then Bongbong Marcos have to come out and pretend he's surprised. He's like, "Oh, I never heard about this agreement. I didn't know about it. I mean, this is bogus. He was. I mean, how could he not know about it? You are the freaking president. How can you not know the prior agreement your government made with another with your neighbor?" So that was completely bogus. But the whole point was, it was to stir up water literally in the South China Sea. So to give an excuse for the US to pivot more military bases to the Philippines. I mean, the whole second Thomas Shaw thing is just a trigger. It's just a trigger. The trigger is Philippines is being used as cat's paw to justify increased U.S. military presence in the Philippines and East Asia, and then they can use this opportunity to cast China as aggressor. So if you notice, now we have like the water cannon fights from all different angles. You go online, from CNN, Wall Street journals, you can see the Chinese Coast Guards almost from every angle, because they have journalists, American journalists, Filipino journalists, they've been flying in and they've been sending on those ships to take pictures, to film, and then to make more anti-China propaganda back home and say, look, China is aggressors. They're shooting water cannon at those helpless Filipino supply ships. But this is what U.S. means when they say we stand by our ironclad commitment, because U.S. is actually not interested. They want to use Philippines as a proxy, the way they use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. But U.S. is not interested to get directly involved. They just want to use this excuse to increase their military presence in the Philippines and to contain China. But Bongbong Marcos actually was interviewed by CNN, by a Filipino reporter. He asked Bongbong Marcos, do you think United States will fight China on behalf of the Philippines? And then Bongbong Marcos was like,
I don't know.
How confident are you the U.S. is willing to go to war with China over a disputed reef in the South China Sea?
Oh, God.
How far is the U.S. prepared to go? What are your talks suggesting to you?
Well, I really... we would...
Yeah, he was like that on camera, but that's the truth. Duterte, in his exclusive interview to Global Times, he said, "I know the U.S. will not die for us. This is why this is such a raw deal for us. U.S. has been pushing us in the front in the confrontation with China, but U.S. will never die for us. They want us to die for them. This is not a good deal for the Philippines. But this is how U.S. media in particular are manipulating this event to, again, just to portray more of China bad, China aggressive,